أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers and sisters and attendees. Inshallah, you're all doing well. We begin today with a new course that this house is offering, the course on logic. And today will be an introductory day. We're not going to go through the text in terms of not having a lesson from the book. We'll just have a general overview of how this course is going to go along and what we're going to do, what's to be expected from the course, what's to be expected from the students. And inshallah, by starting next week, we can delve into the material directly. So this course is titled Logic, and it's an introductory course to logic. Now, obviously, logic has many different levels one could study. Even in the Hujjah, you begin, right now in this date and age, they begin with a book titled Khulasat al-Mantiq, usually. And this is by Shaykh al-Fadli. And it's an introductory book. It's a pretty small book, but it covers almost every chapter in the more advanced book. But it serves as an introduction, and it gives you an overview of whatever is to be studied in logic in terms of the Hujjah. And following that, the students usually go into the book of Al-Mudaffar, Mantiq al-Mudaffar. Mantiq al-Mudaffar was not translated into English. Either, according to my knowledge, Shaykh Khulasat al-Mantiq was not translated either. Actually, it might have been translated by Sayyid Salih. Salih has a book that they translated. That's another book that's in English on logic. Khulasa has not been translated. Mudaffar, a segment of it has been translated by Shaykh Abdul Hakim Karni. I'm not sure if you heard of him. He was here, he was local in Dearborn. He passed away a few years ago. He was an American, he was a convert Shaykh. Very intelligent man. He translated segments. He used to teach at Wayne State University. He taught logic there, and he taught other courses as well. He translated a portion of Mantiq al-Mudaffar. Mantiq al-Mudaffar is composed of 3 volumes, but they're all in one. And I believe he translated the first one. And then what he did was he added his own chapters at the end, because he was a logician himself. He taught logic at the university. So that's an incomplete text that we have. ICAS, Islamic College in England, translated a Persian book that was based on Mantiq al-Mudaffar. So Mantiq al-Mudaffar is in Arabic. This author wrote a logic book that follows the same course as the Mudaffar, and that was translated by Islamic College of Advanced Studies in London. Now, that could be the next course that's taught in the Hujjah on logic, so more in-depth. And with that book, what you can do is you can begin, after getting an overview of logic from this course, you can delve into that and you will go into more detail. So basically what you can do with that book is you can bring contemporary theories on logic, the changes that happen throughout history. You can go more in depth and in detail with regards to logic. But before doing that, you have to have at least an overview of all the chapters that are discussed in logic. Because without having those, it would be difficult to discuss the material, debate it, or have some sort of analysis of it when you're missing some information, because everything is connected to one another. You talk about syllogisms, for example, having premises and conclusions, and the different kinds of categories in a logical proposition, and not being familiar with these would make it difficult for a person to engage in a more deep discussion on these matters. So I think that this book that I uploaded on the WhatsApp group, are you on the group? Serves as a good introduction. It's written in Persian, translated into English. I'll bring my own notes into the course itself to make it thrive. And from then on, once we finish this, we get a complete overview of logic. We've dealt with syllogisms, we've dealt with arguments and argumentation, and we began to know and we became familiar with the terms that are used in logic. Then we can move on to a more advanced course, and that's going to be very exciting because we get to talk about Western logic and how it developed. Because up till the 19th century, the Western world was concerned with Aristotelian logic, and then they kind of branched out and they began developing other types of logical systems, mainly based on language. This is based on categories. So I'll give an example in a little bit. So this is what we're going to do with this course. It's going to serve as an introductory course. That doesn't mean it's a simple course. It doesn't mean that it's something to be taken lightly. We're going to deal with almost everything that's dealt with in any advanced logic course, but we're just not going to go into detail about it. So we're going to introduce it, then we're going to go into detail in another course. So the text is divided into 30 chapters, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Look at the table of contents. Actually, what they did is they divided them into lessons, 30 lessons. So what we can do is we can have one lesson per session. So let's say we're going to have 30 sessions, 30 classes on this course, so 30 weeks basically. And the first few chapters are very simple. We're going to pass through those fairly quickly, but I'm going to introduce my own material into the course. So even though the session seems to be very brief, the material that I'm going to introduce will be enough to fill the whole session. So essentially, we'll have 30 sessions, and the general format that the Hujjah has been following, I'm not sure if have you taken courses before? So this is my first year teaching, and I'm going to finish the syllabus for this course. My other course also, but I was just trying to become familiar with the grading system. So we have a midterm, and that occurs in the first week of January, usually. And then we have a final, which is prior to Shahr Ramadan. So the week before Shahr Ramadan, I believe, is going to be the final exam. And the weight of each exam is divided this way. The midterm is 40%, and the final is 60% of the grade. So they're added together, and then final grade will be given based on addition. So 40%, 60%, that's 100. Whatever you get on those, it would determine your final grade. Over 90%, they categorize as high distinction. 80 to 89 is with distinction. Over 70 is just pass, and anything below that they consider to be not pass. Fail. But basically, they don't want to say that not to discourage the students from thing. Obviously, I don't think anybody in the class is going to get below 70. Inshallah, with the clarifications that are given in the class and the explanations that are given, and I'm going to provide what do we call them? That you read before your exam, the professor for the study guide. There you go. It's been a while. So I'll provide a study guide, and you can follow the study guide. And inshallah, just by following it, you're able to pass the course. And I'll help, with the questions and everything. Inshallah. In Iran, yes, we have an exam at the end of the term only. And it's really, really difficult because you have a book that's about 300 pages of very, very intense material. You can't, yeah, you have to only use your notes because there's no explanation of the text itself. And there's only about 10 questions on the exam, final exam. So 10 questions on 300 pages or more of very, very sophisticated material. And you're supposed to somehow remember that and answer the questions. They don't give study guides in general, but some scholars there, they review. They have like a day or two of reviewing. Others don't do this review. They think that you have to be intelligent not to need the review. So there's different ways that professors deal with over there, scholars, I mean. But the examination system is dictated by the Jamaat al-Mustafa, basically, governing umbrella organization that deals with examinations and the House for Foreign Students. Now, the Iranians have different systems, but the foreigners have to go through this method if you are part of the university. So logic is obviously part of that curriculum. And you cannot move on to other courses without having logic. So for example, the course on the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, usul al-fiqh, a lot of that is derived from logic. And the arguments that are used in it are also derived from logic. So to go into usul al-fiqh, you have to have logic. Even in fiqh sometimes, the way things are explained with usul, you need logic. Going into philosophy, Islamic philosophy, you cannot go into Islamic philosophy without having a strong background on logic. Previously, before Mantiq al-Mulafa, there used to be a book, Al-Hashiyah, Mullah Abdullah. That was the book that was taught. It's a very concise book, very small treatise on logic. And this is a very dense book. It's very small, a few pages, over I think 50 pages. But it's very concise, very dense though. There's no explanations. What Mulafa does is that he provides the material and he explains it very well. The old books on logic don't do that. They just give the principle and, they were relying on people's, yeah. So going into philosophy without logic is, you can't even, it's impossible, you can't do that because philosophy, and at least Islamic philosophy, is founded upon logic. You cannot go into, it's all about argumentation. So you open a book on Islamic philosophy, from beginning to end, it's just argumentation, arguing for the existence of being, the relationship between different existences, and whatnot. So it's all based on logic. So without logic, you can't go into philosophy. Without logic, you can't go into usul al-fiqh. And without usul al-fiqh, you can't understand the fiqh itself, at least a contemporary one. Before, there wasn't much emphasis on usul, as much as there is today. So, but nevertheless, our scholars throughout history began introducing philosophy into usul al-fiqh. And they began trying to understand legal theory through philosophy as well. So any discussion in philosophy that would benefit us in trying to understand how the divine legislates, how he reveals his laws. So for example, how does the divine come about mandating a law on human beings? How does a law become a law? And they divide the movement that happens for a law to come about into categories that are discussed in philosophy when discussing voluntary acts. So for example, first of all, the law has to be imagined. And after it being imagined, the benefit of the law has to also be understood and conceptualized. And once that happens, the benefit has to be to such a degree that creates a desire in the lawmaker to issue forth that law. And once that desire happens, then we know that the divine wants something to happen here. So let's say God wants prayer, wants people to pray, wants to make prayer mandatory upon individuals. there has to be, first of all, an ideation in God's mind. Now, this is all figurative, it's all metaphorical, obviously. But this is talking about the voluntary movements of human beings in general. Before we do something, we first have to imagine it. We have to conceptualize it. And upon conceptualizing this idea, if we believe that this idea is something that should be done, depending on how strong we want it. So let me give an example. Let's say you're hungry, and you have a restaurant. You want to eat. So first, you have to imagine, or you have to understand and conceptualize your hunger, and conceptualize that food is what removes your hunger. And while you're conceptualizing that, you're also conceptualizing that removing the hunger from you is good for you as well. So you're conceptualizing all this. The next step is to reach assent, belief, basically, that this is beneficial for you to get up and do. Now, if you're not really hungry, you just feel a little bit of hunger, but you're busy doing other stuff that are more important, then you might brush that idea off. It's not like to the degree where you would leave stuff and go and act upon your idea. But if you're very hungry, then you would move on to the next step. You have assent, then you would start developing desire inside of you. Desire to go get food to remove your hunger. And this desire has to be strong enough to move you. Once it becomes strong enough, the will comes after that, willpower. And the willpower is what creates the movement. Otherwise, you're sitting on a couch, your food is on the countertop. If you don't have the willpower, that food's going to stay on the countertop and you're not going to move. Even though you're very hungry and you really want to eat, but you're just too lazy to get up. And your laziness at this point is much stronger than your will and desire to get up and eat. So the willpower comes into play. After the will decides that it wants to do something, then the movement occurs. So this is a discussion that's mentioned in philosophy. It's dealt with in philosophy. Basically trying to understand if the voluntary acts happen with a cause or without a cause. What is the cause of an act, a voluntary act? So an involuntary act would be like a twitch or breathing. They categorize it as involuntary. Things that just happen without you having to do them. They just happen automatically. So do voluntary acts have causes or not? This is a discussion in philosophy. To understand that, you have to be able to develop logical propositions, like make up premises and conclusions to, yes, any answer to that question is basically based on a logical formulation. So philosophy without logic is not possible. Usul al-fiqh benefits from philosophy and benefits from logic as well. And in fact, usul al-fiqh has been categorized or termed as the logic of fiqh. So it is in itself a form of logic because it deals with universals that apply to specific fiqhi categories. And you derive laws using those general universal principles. So it's a form of logic, but it's a logic that's specific to a science. It's not logic for all sciences. Whereas this logic is usually described as a tool for all sciences. At least this is how the Islamic scholars have defined it, Shaykh Mullaffar being one of them. He says it's ala qanuniya, or they divide sciences into two different kinds of sciences. Ulum aliyya is one of the divisions, meaning that the science is a tool. It's like a carpenter. He has sciences like biology, for example. It's a science that the end of biology is itself. The reason why I study biology is for the sake of biology. The subject itself is the end of its own self. But if you study things like logic, without applying it to other sciences, it doesn't have any value. Whereas if you study biology and not apply it anywhere, it still has value. You have the information and you can do things with it. But logic itself, if not applied to other sciences, it doesn't have any value in itself. So you take logic and you use it, just like the tools of a carpenter. If he just has tools, then it has no no benefit if you don't apply it to the plan that you have in your mind or whatever you're supposed to use the tools for. So tools without an objective or without something to apply them to have no meaning. Logic is similar to that. Without having a science to apply logic to, then logic becomes, loses its benefit, basically. So this is one of those sciences that they call the ulum aliyah. Now, the logicians, at least in the Islamic world, have said that logic could be applied to all sciences. So basically, in any science, if you ever want to form an argument or come to a conclusion, whether it was inductive or deductive, and we'll get to the detail, the difference of those in a little bit, then you need logic in all sciences. So in biology, basically, you would usually use inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning usually means going from the specific to the general. So basically, let's say you're looking into the reaction of a specific virus, let's say, how it reacts in certain, or how it behaves. So you would study cases. You would see how this virus acts in this body, how it acts on another body, and another body, and another body. Then you gather all this data together, and you form a conclusion based on the gathered data. This is inductive reasoning. You go from the specific cases to the more general. You give a more general conclusion, a more broad conclusion in this case itself. So that's inductive reasoning, and we're going to go into that in this course as well. Then you have deductive reasoning, which is usually going from the general to the specific. So they give a famous example, usually, about Socrates being mortal. So you'll have this is a basic structure. You have premise number one. All men are mortal. Okay, they call this premise. Premise one, then you have premise two. Socrates is a man. That's premise number two. Okay, this is also a premise. The conclusion comes from these two premises. What follows, basically, is that, okay, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So this is a proposition over here. It's over here. Two premises and a conclusion. And this is called deductive reasoning. So basically, going from the general to the specific. We're talking about all men over here. And then from all men, we went to Socrates, which is a specific case over here. This is specific. And all men is general. So you move from the general to the specific. And what they call this is a valid argument because the conclusion follows from the premises. This is a proposition. This is deductive reasoning, basically, which mathematics is basically a deductive science as well. And this was commonly used in the Western world until about the 19th century. But mathematics still uses this format. This is how math functions. Other sciences don't benefit too much from deductive reasoning, again, like biology or chemistry or whatnot. Those base their reasoning on inductive reasoning, basically case studies, then developing a general conclusion based upon those case studies. So we're going to go through the different kinds of propositions in this course, and there are different formats, different forms of these argumentations. We have something called the middle term that reoccurs. We have reoccurrences over here. We have this one reoccurrence over here. So in one premise, you have men and two men, which is the same thing. It's reoccurring in the premises, but you don't find it in the conclusion. And then you have mortal, which reoccurs in the first premise and the conclusion, but it doesn't appear in the second premise. And then you have Socrates, which appears in the second premise and the conclusion, but it's excluded from the first premise. Why does that happen? What's the use of something that's in the premises, but not in the conclusion? Why isn't it over here? If it's part of it, why does it disappear? So, why write it in the first case? So we have to understand the role and objective of these terms and why they occur in the places that they do in this proposition. This is something, again, we're going to discuss in this course. And we're also going to, basically, before going to that, this is the form of the proposition. The argument being valid has nothing to do, basically, with the truthfulness of the premises. So I could replace these with something that's completely absurd. So I can say, for example, all cows. We can just replace these. Just remove this and these. And Socrates out of here, so we don't insult him. So let's say all cows are green. John, the cow, therefore John is green. Is it a valid argument? Completely valid, right? Because the conclusion follows from the premises. Completely valid. But the validity of a proposition has nothing to do with the truthfulness. So the truthfulness and falseness of an argument has nothing to do with the validity of it. So the form could be correct, but the actual content of the premises could be wrong. So all cows are not green. We know that. So how do we know that? Again, this is something else we're going to deal with as well. Where do we get this information from? And how can we correct this? Because if you can make valid arguments of incorrect information, then what's the point of logic? How does it help us create arguments? How does it help us understand truth from falsehood? And how would it help our mind function in a more accurate manner if you're able to inject anything in these propositions and come up with valid arguments? So how do we verify the truthfulness of this? Now, obviously, if you want to understand if all cows are green or not, we use inductive reasoning in this sense, right? We go and we collect samples of cows, like pigeons, for example. Pigeons were thought to be, at least in the Western world, to be white and only white. So one of the arguments they would make is all pigeons are white. Now, that was true for a certain period of time when all the pigeons they saw were white. But now that we know that there are pigeons that are not white, we understand that that is a valid argument, but a false conclusion. So how do we validate these? And how do we deal with that? We're going to get into that as well. So that's very important. You have to have true content, true premises, and you have to have a valid argument as well together in order to have a true argumentation or let's say, I want to pick out the not correct word because in Aristotelian logic, what Aristotle believed logic would do is it would make a person be able to reach truth, which is in a sense equated with reality. That was basically his school. And this logic is called Aristotelian logic because Aristotle was the founder of the logic. And one thing that they mention in the beginning of logic, of course, in the Hujjah, is that Aristotle didn't invent the science. Well, there's also a discussion of whether it's a science or not. Different opinions on that, depending on how you define a science. But let's say it's a science. Aristotle was the founder of the science, but he did not create it. He's not the creator of it. So they call him the discoverer of logic. Because he says that logic is an innate function of the mind of the human being. It's innate in him. Every person thinks logically, whether he studied logic or not. Every day you talk to your friends, you're always making logical arguments. You're talking to your parents, you're thinking in your mind, you're basically thinking in a logical manner. What Aristotle did is he came and he wrote those down as principles in order, because he saw people making mistakes in the way they think. Sometimes they think they reach certainty about something when the premise they have is wrong. So they have a valid argument, but the content is wrong. Sometimes they mix up the premises together, and then they come up with a false and invalid argument. So because people were making mistakes in that, Aristotle thought that he has to come and write this down, formalize it, and then people would be able to study it, and this would improve their argumentation and improve their way of thinking. So this is an issue that is brought up usually, and for those who attack logic, because in the Hujjah there's a movement that didn't accept logic and didn't want it to come into the Islamic world because they thought it's destroying the content of knowledge in Islam. And since it's a Greek science, it's a foreign science. So why should we use a Greek science to understand the Quran or the Hadith and so on and so forth? And in the Christian world, prior to Islam at least, there was also a movement that opposed logic, because the Christians also, the Greeks lived before Christianity. So logic was there even during the time of Jesus and after Jesus, alayhi salam. But in the Islamic world, they became receptive of it, specifically during the Abbasid period, where the translations from Greek to Arabic occurred. Logic was one of those sciences that were translated into Arabic. And obviously there were people who opposed it, rejected it. And even within the Shia world, people reject it. And also, on top of that, if you reject logic, you would reject philosophy as well. They say that the Quran functions in its own system of logic, not the one that's borrowed from the Greeks. Now, these are all very interesting discussions. Does the logic that Aristotle he founded, does it make us reach truth or no? Or is it just giving us valid arguments? His arguments say nothing about reality. This is a question that we have to ponder and think about. Now, Aristotle claimed that we can reach reality with this sort of logic. And you have people on the other side that say, no, reality is much more complex than these premises and conclusions that you come up with here. It could be a valid argument, but it doesn't tell you much about the truth or reality of what you're talking about. So these are all deeper discussions, which I would really enjoy having, but I think that the course isn't designed for this. So maybe the next course, we can start out with discussing these in detail. First of all, discussing the history of logic, where it came from, its validity, how the Islamic world was receptive to it, the schools that opposed it, why did they oppose it? Does it really give us a sense of understanding of reality or not? Why did the Western world move on from Aristotelian logic to other forms of logic in the 19th century onwards? These are all topics that I think we could discuss in more detail later on, inshallah. But for now, we're going to stick with this, inshallah. And we're going to go through the book. Once we get familiar with all the terms, it'll become very fun and exciting that we have all this, then we can play around with them. And it's going to be like an interactive class, because we're going to have propositions. We're going to see how they work, how they don't work. And it'll help us even in our own daily lives. When we're talking to people. You might become an annoying person, when you're talking to someone. There's a flaw in your argument. There's this, there's that. And they'll probably never talk with you again. That's from experience sometimes. So we'll end it over here for today as an introduction. And inshallah, next week we can begin with the text itself, the first lesson. And from there on, we will, inshallah, finish this course. And hopefully we can all benefit from it, inshallah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa ala ahli bayti al-tahirin.